A disabled passenger was nearly denied her right to fly, sparking a captain's bold stand and a cascade of unexpected events. What happened in just minutes left everyone on board shaken and changed air travel discussions forever. This gripping story of courage, conflict, and resilience will leave you questioning everything. Before the story unfolds, let us know where you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more impactful tales from Warming Tales Frias.
A passenger sat in the terminal, looking at the boarding gate with anticipation. It was another flight for her, another trip across the country. But today was different. This time, she had come prepared for her medical needs. After a car accident a year ago, she'd become disabled. Her doctors cleared her to fly. But there were extra precautions that needed to be taken. She had traveled before with no issues, and she assumed this flight would be no different. She wasn't expecting any problems. The flight was running late, but that wasn't unusual. It wasn't until she boarded the plane that things started to feel off. As she made her way down the narrow aisle, she noticed the crew members giving each other quick, uncertain glances. When she reached her seat, she settled in with some help from the attendants. She could feel their eyes on her, though they quickly turned away, busying themselves with their routine checks. But something in the air felt wrong. The plane was nearly full, and passengers were chatting quietly. No one paid much attention to what was happening up front, where the pilot and co-pilot were reviewing their pre-flight checklist. It was the usual process. But today, the pilot had a different set of concerns. A few minutes passed and the captain called over the intercom. The voice was calm but firm. He asked for the crew to assist with a special request regarding the disabled passenger. It wasn't the kind of announcement that should have raised alarms, but it did. Flight attendants, who were already moving through the aisles, stopped in their tracks and whispered to one another. Something wasn't adding up. The captain's words were clear, yet unsettling. "I need to make sure the safety protocols are in place for this flight. If everything isn't in order, we won't take off." He was referring to the disabled passenger. The captain didn't know the full extent of her medical needs, but he knew enough to make him hesitate. Was she seated properly? Were the necessary accommodations being met? Could the crew ensure her safety in case of an emergency? These were the questions running through his mind. As the crew worked to assess the situation, the clock ticked. The plane sat still on the runway, and passengers could sense that something wasn't right. They shifted uncomfortably in their seats. There were murmurs of confusion. Why hadn't they started taxiing? It was just a short delay, or so they thought. Then, after a few more tense moments, the captain made a decision that would change everything. He called the ground crew and asked them to meet him at the gate. It wasn't what anyone expected. His message was direct. He would not allow the flight to take off until the situation was fully addressed. He was concerned for the passengers' safety, yes, but also for the safety of everyone on board. He wasn't willing to take any chances. What followed wasn't just a decision about one passenger's well-being. It was a moment that set off a chain reaction no one saw coming. There were no immediate answers to the questions swirling in the cabin. And in just a matter of minutes, the entire situation would escalate beyond anyone's control. The captain, who was certain in his judgment, didn't realize how quickly things were about to change. As the minutes ticked by, the tension inside the cabin grew. The passengers, who had initially been unaware of the unfolding drama, began to exchange glances. Some had heard the captain's announcement over the intercom. Others had seen the flight attendants whispering to one another. Whispers turned into quiet conversations. The anxiety started to build. The flight had been delayed for almost 20 minutes now, and nobody knew why. The flight attendants, usually calm and composed, looked uneasy as they moved down the aisle, speaking in hushed tones. Some of the passengers, still hopeful that they'd be in the air soon, tried to ignore the growing discomfort in the air. But others, like a man sitting 2 rows behind the disabled passenger, couldn't help but wonder what was going on. His curiosity grew, and he turned to the flight attendant standing near the galley. He asked if the plane was going to take off anytime soon, his voice full of frustration. The attendant gave a tight-lipped smile but said nothing. It wasn't just the cabin crew that seemed on edge now. Even the co-pilot, seen through the cockpit window, was pacing back and forth. The captain had summoned him for a discussion, but the nature of the conversation was unclear. The captain's decisions were never questioned openly, but today was different. On the ground, airport staff had started receiving reports about the delay, but no one had been given the full details. The situation seemed to be spiraling and no one was quite sure how to handle it. The disabled passenger, sitting quietly in her seat, had become the focal point of the delay, though she hadn't caused any trouble. She wasn't asking for special treatment, just the necessary accommodations. Still, it was clear now that the captain wasn't comfortable proceeding without more assurance that everything was in order. Up in the cockpit, the captain was growing more frustrated by the second. He had followed the rules for years. Ensuring safety was his first priority. But today, he felt as if the situation was too uncertain. Was he being too cautious? Was he overreacting? These questions raced through his mind. But the rules were the rules. If there was even the slightest chance that a passenger could be in danger during an emergency, it wasn't worth the risk. The crew continued to huddle in small groups, and it wasn't long before the ground crew arrived at the plane. By now, the passengers were getting restless. The murmurs had turned into louder conversations. Some were beginning to ask for updates, while others were starting to grow irritated. Time was ticking away, and everyone just wanted to get going. Meanwhile, the disabled passenger sat silently in her seat, unaware of the full scope of what was happening. She had done everything she could to prepare for this flight. She had informed the airline about her condition in advance, and all she needed was the flight to proceed smoothly. But instead, she was caught in the middle of a growing storm, a storm she didn't even know was brewing. And as the situation continued to unfold, it became clear that what seemed like a routine flight was quickly turning into something much more complicated. The situation on the plane had reached a boiling point. The flight attendants were now visibly stressed, exchanging quick whispered conversations as they moved through the aisles. The tension was palpable, like a pressure cooker about to explode. Passengers who had been ignoring the delay were now looking out of the windows, fidgeting in their seats, checking their watches and tapping their feet impatiently. The usual hum of casual chatter had turned into a quiet murmur of confusion and frustration. A few minutes later, the captain's voice finally came over the intercom again. This time, it wasn't the usual calm and reassuring tone that passengers had become accustomed to. His voice was more tense, edged with uncertainty. He told the passengers that the plane would remain on the ground for now, and that a serious concern was being addressed. He didn't go into detail, but there was something about his words that made it clear this wasn't just another routine delay. Up in the cockpit, the captain's mind was racing. He had already spoken to the ground staff and airline headquarters, but they had yet to give him the green light to proceed. He was caught between two fears. One, that he might be overreacting to a situation that could have been handled more easily, and two, that if he did move forward without addressing his concerns, it might lead to a catastrophe. This wasn't a decision to be taken lightly. If something went wrong mid-flight, and there was an issue with the disabled passenger's safety or medical needs, the consequences could be severe. The ground crew, now gathered near the jet bridge, were preparing to assist in whatever way they could. They weren't used to situations like this, where a flight was delayed for a passenger's medical reasons. There had been other incidents in the past, medical emergencies during flights, passengers requiring extra help. But this was different. The captain's refusal to move forward wasn't something the ground crew had expected, and they were starting to sense that this was turning into a much bigger problem than anyone had anticipated. On board, the flight attendants were still trying to calm the growing unrest among the passengers. The man who had spoken earlier was now visibly upset, muttering under his breath about the delay and questioning why they couldn't just get moving. He was clearly frustrated. "I don't know what the big deal is," he whispered to the woman sitting next to him. "Why hold us all up for one person?" Another passenger sitting further back overheard the conversation and spoke up. "We don't know the full story," she said softly, though she was clearly uncomfortable with the delay too. Maybe there's something serious going on. She had heard the crew talking about the situation, but like most of the passengers, she didn't know exactly what the issue was. It was all speculation and confusion at this point. As the conversation continued to spread, the disabled passenger sat quietly in her seat, trying to remain calm. She wasn't sure what was happening, but she could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her. She had always tried to avoid drawing attention to her disability, but now it seemed like the whole plane was watching her. The flight attendants occasionally passed by, offering her a reassuring smile, but she could tell that something wasn't right. The crew was too tense. She had never felt so out of place, so singled out. The minutes continued to stretch into what felt like hours. It was already more than 40 minutes since the initial delay, and no one had any clear answers. And then, just when the tension seemed unbearable, the captain made his final decision. He would not fly the plane unless he was certain that every safety measure had been met. This wasn't a decision he had taken lightly, and it was one that would set the stage for the shocking turn of events that would unfold in the next few minutes. What happened next, however, would leave everyone stunned. The captain's decision, his refusal to fly, was just the beginning of a much larger story. A story that would quickly spiral out of control, with consequences neither the passengers nor the crew could have predicted. The crew moved quickly, now under orders to prepare for an emergency meeting. The ground staff arrived at the plane, and the flight attendants began gathering the passengers' attention, asking them to remain seated. By this time, the whispers had turned into full-blown conversations. People were talking about the delay, speculating on what had caused it. Some were frustrated, some were confused, and others were beginning to grow concerned about missing connections or important appointments. In the cockpit, the captain had already spoken to the airline's head office and reviewed the situation once again. His stance remained firm. He would not allow the flight to take off until he was absolutely sure that the disabled passengers' needs had been met in full. The captain wasn't only concerned about the woman's well-being, but also about the safety of everyone on board. He knew the rules, and he knew that if something went wrong, it could cost him his job, or worse. The responsibility weighed heavily on him. As the ground crew prepared for the next steps, a more senior airline officer arrived at the scene, exchanging a few hurried words with the captain. The officer seemed calm, but it was clear that the situation had escalated beyond what anyone had anticipated. The captain had refused to move the plane, but now the airline's management had to decide how to proceed. Meanwhile, back on the plane, the disabled passenger was still unaware of the full extent of what was happening. She had seen the flight attendants talking to each other more urgently, but no one had addressed her directly. She wasn't sure whether she should feel relieved or anxious. Was there something wrong with her seating? Had she done something to cause the delay? Was she at fault? The flight attendants finally made their way to her, one by one, offering polite smiles but avoiding eye contact. It was clear they were uncomfortable, and the woman couldn't help but feel a sense of dread building inside her. Something was happening behind the scenes, and she was caught in the middle of it. Then, just when it seemed like the situation couldn't get any more tense, the airline officer made an announcement that would change everything. As the captain's decision lingered in the air, the officer's voice came through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen," the officer began, "I regret to inform you that there has been a change of plans. The pilot will not be continuing with this flight. We are in the process of reassigning a new captain. Please remain seated, and we will provide further updates shortly." A stunned silence swept through the cabin. Passengers looked at each other in disbelief. Had the captain been replaced? Why? And more importantly, what did this mean for the flight? The atmosphere shifted from frustration to confusion, and the disabled passenger felt her anxiety rise. She was now the center of attention, though no one had said a word to her directly. She could sense the shift in the air, and it wasn't long before she realized that something much larger was happening. Whatever had prompted the pilot's refusal to fly wasn't just about her needs. It was about something much bigger. As the crew scrambled to make new arrangements, no one knew what would come next. But one thing was certain. The situation had spiraled out of control in a way no one could have predicted. The pilot who had refused to take off was now out of the equation, but what lay ahead was still uncertain. The disabled passenger, the reason for this unprecedented delay, was now at the heart of a decision that no one could have foreseen. Just 7 minutes ago, the plane was ready to take off. Now it was stuck on the tarmac, with no clear answers in sight. What was about to happen next would not only affect the passengers, but it would also make waves within the airline industry itself. The announcement hung in the air, leaving everyone in stunned silence. The flight attendants quickly moved down the aisle, trying to calm the passengers, but there was no disguising the confusion and frustration that had taken hold of the cabin. The disabled passenger, still sitting quietly in her seat, felt the weight of the situation growing heavier with each passing second. It wasn't just the delay, it was the fact that the entire plane seemed to be focused on her, even though no one had directly addressed her concerns. She could feel their eyes on her, and the uncomfortable tension was palpable. Minutes turned into what felt like hours as the new captain made his way to the cockpit, replacing the original pilot who had refused to take off. The flight attendants had a quiet meeting in the galley, and a few passengers could be seen peering over at them, trying to make sense of the situation. The air was thick with unspoken questions, and for the first time that day, the disabled passenger felt a sense of dread wash over her. She had done everything the airline had asked. She'd informed them of her needs, followed all the rules, and yet here she was, caught in the middle of something she didn't fully understand. The new captain, a man in his early 50s, finally appeared from the cockpit, his expression unreadable. He gave a quick nod to the flight attendants and moved down the aisle, heading straight for the disabled passenger seat. The moment was heavy with expectation. Was he going to address the situation? Would he be as unwilling to fly her as the first pilot had been? The passenger's heart raced in her chest as she tried to gauge the look on his face. His eyes met hers, but he said nothing at first, just offering a polite but distant smile. The flight attendant who had been hovering nearby gave a soft but reassuring nod. She seemed to want to speak, but the captain beat her to it. "I understand there's been some confusion," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We're going to get you taken care of. I just need to check a few things." The disabled passenger nodded, grateful that he had acknowledged her presence. But as he walked away to speak with the crew, she couldn't help but feel a growing unease. What had happened to make the previous pilot refuse to fly? Why had the decision been made so suddenly? And perhaps most troubling of all, would the new captain make the same decision? It didn't take long for the flight attendants to start moving again. They began quietly speaking to the passengers, reassuring them that the new captain was in charge now, and that they should expect to depart soon. But the uneasy silence lingered. No one knew what was going to happen next. A few minutes later, the captain returned, and he wasted no time addressing the cabin. "I've spoken to the ground crew, and we've made sure all the necessary accommodations have been arranged. We'll be departing shortly," he said, his voice still calm, though there was an unmistakable tension in the air. But something about his words didn't sit right with the passengers. The disabled passenger could hear the subtle murmurs from the rows behind her. Some of them were still discussing the decision of the previous pilot, while others simply wanted to know if the flight was finally going to take off. They were tired of sitting there stuck in limbo. She couldn't blame them. She too wanted the flight to end, just to get it over with. She didn't want to be the cause of the delay any longer. As the captain finished his announcement, there was a brief pause before the flight attendants began moving through the aisles again. This time, their steps seemed more purposeful, more organized. One by one, the passengers began to settle into a new rhythm, waiting for the plane to finally take off. But despite the captain's reassurances, the uncertainty still lingered. The previous pilot's refusal to fly had shaken everyone involved, and now, even though the situation seemed resolved on the surface, no one was quite sure how things would turn out. For the disabled passenger, however, it felt like everything had changed. Just moments ago, she'd been expecting nothing more than a routine flight. But now she was at the center of something much bigger, something that had the potential to ripple through the airline industry in ways no one could predict. And yet, as the plane's engines began to roar to life and the aircraft slowly started to move down the tarmac, one thought kept running through her mind. What had just happened? The plane slowly started to taxi down the runway, and as the engines rumbled to life, the passengers finally began to relax, though the tension never quite disappeared. There was still an unease in the air, a feeling that something had shifted in the dynamic of the flight. The disabled passenger, now buckled in her seat, couldn't shake the nagging sense that this wasn't just a routine flight anymore. Something had happened, and it had set everything off balance. As the plane picked up speed on the runway, the flight attendants moved through the cabin with more focus now, handing out drinks and snacks with brisk efficiency. The usual in-flight chatter had returned, but there was a quieter undercurrent to it. Every so often, she'd catch a passenger looking back toward her. She wasn't sure if it was pity, curiosity, or something else, but the attention was unmistakable. She felt as if everyone knew that she had been the reason for the delay, even though she had done nothing wrong. In her mind, she had followed all the necessary protocols, informed the airline, and ensured her safety precautions were in place. Yet here she was, stuck in the middle of a situation that wasn't hers to begin with. In the cockpit, the new captain was still reviewing the flight's progress and communicating with the ground crew. His mind was running through the checklist of his own decisions, making sure he hadn't missed anything. The previous captain's refusal to fly had thrown off the flight plan, and now he had to make sure everything was in order for a smooth departure. But as he glanced at the plane's instrument panel, his thoughts drifted back to the incident. He wasn't one to second-guess another pilot's judgment. But the refusal had made him wonder. Had the first pilot overstepped his authority? The new captain had been with the airline for decades and knew the rules like the back of his hand. Safety was always a top priority, but there were procedures in place for handling medical situations. It was uncommon for a pilot to refuse a flight unless there was a clear, immediate safety threat. The fact that the first captain had refused to fly a passenger due to her disability was puzzling. Sure, she might have needed extra assistance, but this wasn't the first time an airline had dealt with a disabled passenger. The captain couldn't help but feel that the situation was handled poorly. The decision seemed too harsh, and now he was the one who had to pick up the pieces. Back in the cabin, the flight attendants moved in sync, ensuring that all the passengers were comfortable, though their eyes occasionally flickered toward the cockpit, a silent acknowledgement of the chaos that had just unfolded. The disabled passenger could see the subtle shift in the attendants' demeanor. They weren't as friendly as they had been at the start of the flight. There was an undercurrent of discomfort in the way they approached her. She couldn't help but wonder if they blamed her for the situation. Maybe they thought she had caused the delay, or was somehow responsible for the captain's decision to ground the flight. It wasn't just her imagination. She could feel their unease every time they walked past her seat. One of the flight attendants, noticing the woman's uneasy expression, stopped to speak with her, offering a small, tight-lipped smile. "We're sorry for the delay, ma'am," the attendant said in a calm but distant voice. "Everything should be fine now. The new captain has everything under control." The words were polite, but they didn't reassure the passenger. The attendant quickly moved on, leaving her with more questions than answers. Was everything really under control? Or was the captain still unsure about flying me? The plane continued its journey down the runway, gaining speed as the roar of the engines filled the cabin. The passengers were finally starting to settle in, but the ripple effect of the earlier events still clung to the atmosphere. For the disabled passenger, it felt like the weight of the world was on her shoulders. She had done nothing to cause the delay, yet she was the one at the center of the storm. The uncertainty that had filled the cabin moments ago hadn't fully dissipated, and the nerves of the passengers were still palpable. In the distance, the city lights below were twinkling, a sign that they were leaving the ground behind. As the plane ascended, climbing higher into the night sky, the disabled passenger looked out the window, her mind racing. What had caused the original pilot to refuse to fly? She had tried to be patient, to trust that everything would work out, but now she was filled with doubt. She had been through so much already, and she didn't need this added stress. She had just wanted a simple flight to her destination. But there was something else gnawing at her. A nagging feeling that the events of the last hour weren't as simple as they seemed. The refusal to fly, the sudden change of captain, the discomfort that had spread through the cabin, everything felt like a warning sign. She didn't know it yet, but the situation that had just unfolded would spark a larger conversation about airline policies, the treatment of disabled passengers, and the decisions made by flight crews in high-pressure situations. As the plane leveled out and the seatbelt sign was turned off, the disabled passenger exhaled deeply. She couldn't shake the feeling that the turbulence she had just experienced wasn't over. It was only a matter of time before the truth came out about the pilot's refusal, the airline's handling of the situation, and the way she had been caught in the middle of it all. But for now, she sat quietly, her mind still spinning, unsure of what the future would hold. The flight attendants resumed their duties, moving more slowly now, as if they too were waiting for something. The passengers, many of whom had tried to put the delay behind them, were now whispering among themselves, their curiosity piqued by the events of the past hour. It was only a matter of time before the story spread beyond this flight, of how one pilot had made a bold, controversial decision, and how another captain had been forced to step in and pick up the pieces. And as the plane sailed through the clouds, one thing was certain: this would not be the last time anyone would hear about what had just happened. As the plane cruised smoothly through the night sky, the disabled passenger settled into her seat, trying to calm the storm of thoughts in her mind. She had hoped for a peaceful flight, but the events of the past hour had left her shaken. Despite the reassuring words from the flight attendant, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her anxiety began to bubble to the surface as she replayed everything in her head: how the first pilot had refused to fly her, the awkward tension in the cabin, and now the abrupt change in leadership. She had always tried to be strong, to not let her disability define her, but today had tested her in ways she hadn't anticipated. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, signaling the start of the in-flight service, and passengers began to settle in. The man who had been speaking about the delay earlier now seemed content, chatting away with his seatmate as if nothing had happened. He had already forgotten about the tension from earlier. Others, however, were still glancing nervously at the flight attendants and whispering quietly amongst themselves. It was clear that people were still processing what had transpired, but there was little they could do now except wait for the flight to reach its destination. The flight attendants, though more relaxed than before, still carried a subtle air of discomfort. They moved through the aisles with a kind of measured calmness, handing out drinks and snacks, but their interactions with the passengers were brief and somewhat strained. It was as if they were walking on eggshells, careful not to step on any toes after what had just unfolded. The disabled passenger couldn't help but notice the way they avoided making direct eye contact with her as they passed by. She wasn't sure if it was just her imagination, but she felt like they were still uncomfortable, perhaps unsure about how to deal with the fallout from the captain's refusal to fly her earlier. As she gazed out the window, watching the lights of the city below flicker in the distance, her mind wandered back to the moment when the first pilot had made his decision. She had been caught off guard by the refusal, but what truly surprised her was how quickly everything had escalated. Just 7 minutes after the captain had made his call, the entire situation had shifted. The ground crew had intervened, a new captain was brought in, and now here she was, on her way to her destination, though still uncertain about what had just happened. It was hard for her to shake the feeling that something deeper was at play, something that went beyond her individual case. The new captain, whom she had barely spoken to, seemed calm and confident, but his actions were still on her mind. He had reassured the passengers that everything was under control, but she wondered if he had truly understood the complexity of the situation. Was he fully aware of the tension the refusal had caused, and was the first pilot really in the wrong? She had seen the look in the flight attendants' eyes when they had spoken about the incident, and it was clear they had their own opinions. Some seemed to understand the captain's caution, while others appeared to be questioning his decision. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how little she knew about the inner workings of the airline industry. She was just a passenger, trying to get from point A to point B. But what had happened today was much bigger than her individual journey. The refusal to fly her had sparked a cascade of reactions, from the pilot's decision to the airline's intervention to the confusion and frustration of the other passengers. It was clear that the airline had been caught in a difficult position, one that many wouldn't have seen coming. The question now was, what would be the long-term impact of this incident? Would it lead to changes in policy? Would it change the way disabled passengers were treated on flights? She didn't know, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a one-time occurrence. There would be more to this story, and it would reach far beyond the walls of this aircraft. Back in the cabin, the flight attendants were wrapping up the meal service, and the mood had lightened slightly. People were beginning to relax again, though the energy was still far from what it had been at the beginning of the flight. The disabled passenger shifted in her seat, still trying to process everything that had happened. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, trying to piece together the sequence of events. She hadn't caused any trouble, hadn't asked for anything unreasonable. Yet she had found herself at the center of a storm, caught between a pilot's responsibility for safety and the airline's obligation to accommodate passengers. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how vulnerable she had felt during those minutes when the flight was delayed. It wasn't just the fear of not being able to fly. It was the sense of being scrutinized, of having her every move watched and analyzed. She wasn't just a passenger anymore. She was the reason for the delay, the cause of the chaos. That realization stung more than she cared to admit. She had always prided herself on her independence, her ability to travel and live life on her own terms, but today had shaken that confidence. The system had let her down, the airline had let her down. But as the flight leveled out and the sounds of the engines grew steadier, the disabled passenger found herself taking a deep breath. She knew that there was nothing more she could do. The decision had been made, and she was now a part of something larger than herself. She couldn't change what had happened, but she could learn from it. This wasn't the end of the story, not by a long shot. What had occurred on this flight would linger in her mind for a long time. The questions, the uncertainty, the discomfort, all of it would stay with her. But one thing was certain. She wouldn't forget this experience anytime soon, and she hoped that, somehow, it might lead to a better understanding of how airlines should treat passengers like her in the future. As the plane continued its journey, her thoughts shifted toward what lay ahead. The turbulence she had faced wasn't just physical, it was emotional, and it had left a lasting impact. But in that moment, she also knew something important. She wasn't just a passenger anymore. She was a witness to a moment in time that might change things for others who came after her. The hours passed, and the plane flew steadily through the night, the hum of the engines the only sound that filled the cabin. Despite the quiet, the atmosphere had a strange heaviness to it. Passengers were settled, but many were still glancing around nervously, unsure of what had really happened during the delay, even though the flight had resumed and everything seemed to be running smoothly. The tension had not completely dissipated. Conversations were quieter now, and eyes flickered toward the flight attendants as they moved through the aisles, their steps more deliberate than usual. The disabled passenger, who had been trying to relax, found herself struggling to settle. She'd hoped the flight would give her time to think and unwind, but instead, her mind was still racing, replaying every detail of the day. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, not just by the flight attendants, but by her fellow passengers too. Every subtle glance, every hushed word, seemed to remind her of how out of place she felt now. She had been just another passenger before all of this. But now, after the incident with the captain, she was acutely aware that her presence had altered the dynamic of the entire flight. It was a strange and uncomfortable realization. She wasn't just a traveler in a seat. She was the cause of something bigger. No matter how hard she tried to focus on her book or the in-flight entertainment, the nagging feeling remained. Her eyes drifted to the aisle, where the flight attendants were again speaking in hushed tones. They were still clearly on edge, their conversations more cautious now, as if they too were waiting for something to happen. Despite the unease, the disabled passenger knew she couldn't change anything now. The flight was in the air. The captain had made his decision and there was nothing more to be done. Yet, as the hours passed, the more she realized that this incident wouldn't just fade away when the plane landed. It was a conversation that would keep going, long after they touched down at their destination. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the new captain was still going over the situation in his head. He had made the decision to proceed with the flight, but in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the lingering doubt about the previous pilot's actions. The refusal to fly a disabled passenger wasn't a typical situation, and the more he thought about it, the more he questioned whether it had been the right call. In his years of flying, he'd faced plenty of medical emergencies, plenty of complicated situations with passengers. But it had never been like this. The situation had escalated quickly, and it was clear that there was more to it than just the disabled woman's needs. The passengers on board had no idea how deeply this decision would affect the airline, the policies that governed flights, and the internal reviews that would follow. What really struck him was how quickly the airline had acted. Within minutes of the original captain's refusal, the ground crew had been called, the airline's legal team was involved, and a new captain had been assigned. It wasn't just a delay, it was a systemic failure of communication and decision-making. And though he hadn't been the one to make the controversial call, he couldn't help but feel the ripple effects of it. He knew that the decision he'd made to proceed with the flight was the right one for safety's sake. But there was a lingering question of whether there was a better way to handle it all. The disabled passenger, meanwhile, was struggling with her own thoughts. She had tried to push the incident from her mind, but it lingered like a shadow. Every slight movement from the flight attendants, every muffled conversation between passengers, seemed to remind her of what had happened. She couldn't help but feel that she had become a symbol of something, a symbol of frustration, confusion, and perhaps even fear. The whispers and sideways glances made it hard for her to ignore the fact that her presence had changed everything. At some point, the pilot's decision, whether it was right or wrong, had stopped being just a matter of safety. It had become about the optics, the emotions, the underlying dynamics between passengers, crew, and the airline itself. Her anxiety grew as she thought about the ripple effect of her simple need for assistance. The situation was snowballing, and though it had begun with her, it was now much larger. It wasn't just about getting from one place to another anymore. It had become about policies, procedures, and how the airline viewed its disabled passengers. And that made her feel smaller and smaller with each passing minute. The flight attendants moved through the cabin again, offering refreshments and checking on passengers. But their eyes, though polite, were different now. The way they interacted with her was more formal, distant. She could sense that something had changed in the way they viewed her. At first they had been warm and kind, but now they seemed to be going through the motions. It wasn't their fault, she knew that. But it still stung. She wanted to explain that she wasn't asking for special treatment, that she wasn't the cause of the trouble, but the words didn't come. Instead, she sat in silence, staring out the window as the city lights disappeared into the distance, replaced by the vast emptiness of the open sky. As the miles stretched on, her mind kept returning to the same question. What would the consequences of this incident be? Her thoughts drifted again to the moments on the ground, to the captain's refusal, to the confusion that had followed. She was no longer just a passenger on a plane. She had become part of a story that was bound to make waves. The pilot had made his decision based on what he believed was right, but now the larger question was about how the system had failed her, and how the airline would handle this kind of situation in the future. Soon, as the plane crossed into a new time zone, the lights inside the cabin dimmed further, signaling that the crew would soon be preparing for the descent. But even as the plane began to make its final approach, the disabled passenger couldn't shake the sense that this story wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. The questions lingered, unresolved. The debate about the pilot's actions was only just beginning to take shape in her mind. The flight had been delayed. The captain was replaced, but the real journey for her, for the airline, and for everyone involved, was just getting started. The descent into the destination airport was steady, and the plane began its gradual descent as the flight attendants made their final rounds, securing the cabin for landing. The disabled passenger still sat quietly in her seat, her thoughts far away from the routine final stages of the flight. The unsettling feeling that had been building inside her since the moment the captain refused to fly her had not gone away. And as the wheels touched down on the tarmac, it felt like a chapter of her life had just ended. Yet somehow, it had left her in the middle of a much bigger story, one that she didn't fully understand. The plane taxied to the gate, and the customary "thank you for flying with us" announcement came over the intercom. For a moment, it was as if nothing had happened at all. Passengers gathered their belongings, preparing to disembark, chatting about their destinations and going about their usual end-of-flight routines. But for the disabled passenger, it wasn't so simple. She sat there, almost frozen in her seat, as the cabin slowly emptied. She wasn't sure what to do next. Should she say something? Would anyone even listen to her at this point? As the last few passengers exited, the flight attendants gave her polite but curt smiles. They were wrapping up their duties, ready to move on to the next flight. But their expressions were tight, their gestures quick and rehearsed. She caught one of the attendants glance at her, and for a moment, their eyes met. There was something unspoken in that brief exchange, a silent understanding that whatever had happened in the past few hours wasn't just an ordinary inconvenience. It had become something much larger, something that couldn't easily be swept under the rug. The attendant quickly turned away, but the moment lingered. When she finally stepped off the plane, her legs felt weak, her mind even weaker. As she moved through the terminal, the quiet bustle of the airport felt almost foreign to her now. The hum of announcements, the rush of travelers hurrying to their next gate, all of it felt distant. But there was one thing that had become crystal clear during the course of this flight. The incident wasn't over. It wasn't just about her, and it wasn't just about the pilot. It was about the bigger picture, the system, the protocols, the choices that were made in those crucial moments when things went wrong. She headed to baggage claim, her eyes scanning the area without really focusing on anything. The events of the flight played over in her mind once more. The captain's refusal, the rushed decision to replace him, the way the entire situation seemed to escalate so quickly. But there was more she was beginning to understand. This wasn't just about a single pilot's choice. It was a failure of communication, of procedure, and maybe even a failure to understand the needs of passengers like her. She couldn't help but wonder how many others had been in situations like this, where the system had let them down or made them feel less than they were. The news of what had happened would spread fast. She was sure of it. People loved stories like this, stories of unexpected drama and conflict, and this one had all the ingredients. A disabled passenger denied a flight, a captain who made a controversial call, a new captain who had to step in and take charge. It would make headlines somewhere, even if it wasn't hers to control. It had already affected the flight, the crew, and the passengers. But what about her? As the carousel slowly turned and her luggage appeared, she felt the weight of the moment settle in. It wasn't just about the inconvenience of a delayed flight anymore. It was about a decision, a choice that had been made about her. Without her input, without a clear understanding of her needs, and without any real explanation for why it had gone so far. She wasn't angry, not really. She understood why the captain made the call he did, but there was something deeper here that bothered her. It was the realization that in situations like these, passengers like her were often left in the dark. She didn't know what was going to happen next, but she felt certain that something needed to change. Back at the airline's customer service desk, there was a line of passengers waiting to speak with an agent, most of them no doubt dealing with their own issues after the flight delay. She could hear snippets of conversations as she walked past, complaints about missed connections, frustration over the delay, apologies from the airline. They were all dealing with the inconvenience of a delayed flight, but what had happened on her flight went beyond mere inconvenience. She couldn't help but overhear a few people talking about the situation in passing, their words full of curiosity and judgment. "She was the reason we were delayed," one passenger muttered to his friend. "I don't get why they didn't just let her fly. Seems like they overreacted." The disabled passenger paused for a moment, her chest tightening at the mention of her name in the conversation, but she kept walking. There was no point in engaging with the comment, not now, not after everything that had happened. She was beginning to realize that the opinions of others didn't matter. What mattered was how the airline handled it, how the system would respond, and what would come of it all in the future. The more she thought about it, the more she knew this wasn't just a one-off incident. She had felt like a scapegoat, like her presence had somehow created a ripple that turned into a wave. The airline, the crew, the passengers, they were all affected by the decision. But she wasn't the only one who had been made uncomfortable in this situation. What happened on this flight could change things, at least for others who found themselves in similar circumstances. By the time she had retrieved her bag and made her way toward the exit, she felt a certain sense of resolve. The incident wasn't just a story for the headlines or a footnote in her journey. It had been a wake-up call, a moment of clarity about how disabled passengers were treated, how their needs were sometimes dismissed or misunderstood, and how easily things could spiral out of control in a system that wasn't prepared to handle the complexities of such situations. The flight had ended, but the conversation was just beginning. And as she left the airport, she knew that it wasn't over. Not for her, and not for the airline either. The ripples of that flight would be felt far beyond the cabin. The questions would be asked, the system would be scrutinized, and the story would live on, whether she wanted it to or not. The days that followed felt like a blur. The disabled passenger had hoped that, after disembarking and leaving the airport behind, she could finally put the entire experience out of her mind. She had arrived at her destination, and everything was supposed to return to normal. Yet it was clear that things would never be the same. The ripples from that flight had already started to spread beyond the plane and the airport. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from family and friends who had heard about the incident through the media. Word had spread quickly, as it always did when a story like this hit the news cycle. The story of the pilot refusing to fly a disabled passenger was too compelling for the media to ignore. Articles began popping up on social media, in newspapers, and on news websites. Most of them focused on the controversy of the pilot's decision. Some sided with him, claiming that safety protocols had to come first, that the captain was just doing his job. Others, however, were more critical, questioning why the passenger wasn't accommodated in a more understanding way. Some headlines even hinted at the broader issue of how airlines handle passengers with disabilities. It didn't take long before public opinion became divided. Was the captain right to refuse her? Or had the airline mishandled the entire situation? The disabled passenger tried to avoid reading the articles, but it was impossible. Her name, though not always mentioned directly, was tied to the incident. Some media outlets had included details about her condition, sharing the fact that she had been involved in a car accident, while others were quick to criticize the airline for not having procedures in place to handle medical situations like hers more smoothly. It was all too much. For the first time in a long while, she realized how exposed she felt. What had been a personal, private matter had suddenly been thrust into the public eye. It wasn't just the stress of dealing with a disability that had been challenging. It was the realization that in this world, being disabled meant being constantly scrutinized, and this incident had turned her into a symbol of something bigger than herself. She spent the next few days with a sense of unease, as though she were waiting for the storm to break. She knew she wasn't the only person who had experienced difficulties flying due to a disability, but the public nature of this incident made it feel like she had been singled out. She didn't ask for any of this, and yet it was happening. The more she thought about it, the more she realized just how deeply the incident had affected her. It wasn't just the flight itself, but the way it had left her feeling powerless in a system that was supposed to support her. She had followed all the necessary protocols, communicated her needs, and still, she had been denied a simple service. The system had failed her, And now, as the media coverage continued, she realized that the airline would have to answer for that failure. It wasn't long before she received an official letter from the airline. It arrived via email first, followed by a printed copy sent to her home address. The letter began with an apology for the unfortunate events that had occurred during her flight. The airline expressed regret that she had been made to feel uncomfortable and assured her that they were reviewing the situation. It promised a thorough investigation into the incident, as well as a commitment to improving the training of flight crews in handling passengers with medical conditions. Though the letter was polite and formal, it felt hollow to her. It was clear that the airline was doing damage control, trying to protect its reputation. The letter's assurances about improving policies felt more like a response to public outrage than a genuine effort to address the root of the problem. She could almost hear the corporate machine working in the background, trying to make the issue go away without truly confronting the deeper issues. The more she read through the letter, the more she felt a growing sense of frustration. It wasn't just the inconvenience of the delay, or the fact that she had been subjected to unnecessary scrutiny. It was the fact that no one seemed to truly understand her needs, or the needs of passengers like her. The airline's response was typical of many institutions: a quick apology, a promise of change, and a vague assurance that everything would be fine moving forward. But nothing really changed unless those in charge took a hard look at the systemic issues that led to incidents like this. She couldn't ignore the nagging thought that the airline's investigation would ultimately be an exercise in PR, an attempt to protect their interests rather than an attempt to genuinely improve their handling of passengers with disabilities. And for the first time, she realized just how little power she had in this situation. She could write letters, file complaints, share her story, but in the end, it was the airline that had the power to shape the narrative. The whole system was stacked against her, and that realization stung more than she cared to admit. The media attention around the incident didn't stop with the airline's apology. In fact, it only grew. Over the next week, there were debates on talk shows, articles, and social media posts dissecting the situation. Some people defended the captain's decision, arguing that safety was paramount and that the rules should always be followed. Others, however, pointed out that airlines have a responsibility to accommodate passengers, especially those with visible or invisible disabilities. The narrative began to shift, and more people started to question how airlines dealt with passengers like her, people who needed assistance or special accommodations. The debate had moved from the specifics of this particular flight to the larger issue of accessibility in air travel. Her story had become a part of that larger conversation. Her experience had sparked a much-needed discussion about how airlines treat passengers with disabilities, the challenges that disabled travelers face, and the importance of better policies and training. She was still unsure of what to make of all of this. Part of her felt overwhelmed by the attention, but part of her also felt proud that her experience had become a catalyst for change. She wasn't the only person who had suffered because of poor policies. She wasn't the only person who'd been made to feel like an inconvenience for simply needing help. Despite the overwhelming nature of it all, she also began to feel a sense of resolve. This wasn't just about one flight or one captain's decision. It was about a larger systemic issue. She had been thrust into the middle of a difficult conversation, and though it was uncomfortable and at times painful, she knew that something had to change. She didn't want her experience to just fade away in the wake of the media frenzy. She wanted it to lead to something more meaningful, a shift in how airlines and society as a whole viewed and treated people with disabilities. As the days passed and the media attention slowed, she realized that this was far from over. This wasn't just her story anymore. It was a story that had the potential to spark real change. And she, whether she liked it or not, had become part of the movement. The question now was whether the airline and the industry as a whole would respond in a way that genuinely addressed the needs of disabled passengers, or whether this would be another missed opportunity. Weeks had passed since the flight, but the ripple effects from the incident seemed to grow with each passing day. The disabled passenger's life, which had once been ordinary, had now become entangled in a national conversation about airline practices, disability rights, and the ways in which society treats people with disabilities. She had tried to return to a sense of normalcy, but it felt impossible. The media's continued focus on her story had kept the issue alive. She would open her email to find messages from reporters asking for interviews or for comments about the situation. Her phone rang constantly with calls from journalists, curious to hear her side of the story. Social media was filled with opinions, some supportive, others critical, but all eager to discuss her experience and the larger issue at hand. She had always been a private person, someone who preferred to go about her life without drawing attention. But now, it felt as if every step she took was scrutinized. She would go to the grocery store and hear people whispering behind her, wondering if she was the same person from the news. It was uncomfortable, unnerving even. She hadn't chosen to become the face of a movement, yet here she was, carrying the weight of something much larger than her personal experience. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that this was not just about her anymore. It was about the thousands of passengers like her, people who had faced similar challenges and who had been overlooked by a system that was supposed to support them. Despite her reluctance, she began to use the attention to her advantage. She realized that she had a rare opportunity to push for change, to turn this negative experience into something more meaningful. She began reaching out to disability advocacy groups, offering to share her story in a more organized way, focusing on the larger picture of accessibility and rights for disabled travelers. Slowly, she started speaking at forums, participating in interviews, and attending meetings with those who were in positions to influence change. It was exhausting work, but it felt necessary. She couldn't ignore the fact that something had to be done. And while it was uncomfortable to be at the forefront of such a public conversation, she also knew that her voice mattered. She had been directly affected by a system that failed her, and she had a responsibility to make sure that this wouldn't just fade into the background. One of the first things she did was reach out to advocacy organizations for people with disabilities, especially those focused on accessibility in air travel. They were eager to collaborate, and it was through these partnerships that she learned just how deep the issue ran. Airlines for years had been resistant to making any significant changes to accommodate disabled passengers. There were some improvements here and there, wheelchair access, special seating arrangements, medical support, but it was clear that the broader system had been insufficient. Training for flight attendants and pilots on how to properly handle medical needs was often minimal. There was no standard procedure for dealing with passengers who required special accommodations beyond the typical requests. She learned, too, that her experience was not unique. There were countless stories of passengers with disabilities who had been left stranded, denied service, or treated with indifference by airline staff. Some had even been made to feel like they were burdens or inconveniences. The disabled community, she realized, had been fighting this battle for years. But now, with the media spotlight on her experience, there was a glimmer of hope that things could finally change. But it wasn't going to be easy. Change, as she quickly discovered, was slow, especially when it came to large corporations like airlines. Despite the airlines' promises to review their policies, she saw little evidence of real action. The airline had issued its public apology and promised to improve its training and accessibility protocols, but there were no tangible signs that they were making any meaningful progress. The airline's response was more of a public relations move than a genuine effort to fix the underlying problem. This realization didn't deter her. If anything, it fueled her drive even more. She began to push harder, leveraging the media coverage to keep the issue in the public eye. She wrote op-eds, participated in panel discussions, and spoke at conferences. She found herself talking not just about her own experience, but about the systemic issues in air travel and the urgent need for comprehensive change. It wasn't just about one flight. It was about how the entire industry needed to rethink its approach to passengers with disabilities. One of the key points she began to emphasize was the need for better training for all airline staff, from pilots to gate agents to flight attendants. She argued that crew members should be educated on the wide range of disabilities and medical needs that passengers could have, and how to respond in an empathetic, professional way. She also advocated for clearer, more consistent policies that addressed not only the physical needs of passengers, but also their emotional and psychological needs. A disabled passenger wasn't just someone who required a wheelchair. They were a person who might have complex medical conditions, fears of flying, or other challenges that needed to be taken into account. The airline industry was not known for its speed in implementing change, but the disabled passenger had begun to see some movement. Some smaller airlines had started to implement new accessibility training programs, and certain advocacy groups had begun pushing for legislative changes that would require airlines to adhere to stricter guidelines for disabled passengers. While these efforts were still in their infancy, it was a start. She didn't expect immediate sweeping changes, but she did feel that the conversation was beginning to shift. The incident had sparked a conversation that went far beyond the confines of one delayed flight. It had ignited a fire for change, and even though the road ahead was long, she felt like the conversation was finally headed in the right direction. At the same time, the disabled passenger found herself growing more reflective. She thought about the impact of the experience on her own life. The attention had been overwhelming, but it had also been an opportunity for growth. She had learned that her voice could make a difference, that her story could contribute to something bigger than herself. And though the journey had been fraught with emotional strain, it had also been empowering. She had been thrust into the center of a conversation she hadn't asked for, but one that, in the end, was necessary. As she continued to work alongside disability advocates, she found a sense of purpose she hadn't expected. The journey wasn't over, and she knew that there was still so much work to be done. But for the first time since that flight, she didn't feel alone. She was part of a much larger movement, one that would demand better treatment for disabled passengers, not just in air travel, but across all aspects of public life. And she wasn't going to stop until the system began to change. For her, this wasn't just a battle she was fighting anymore. It was a fight for all disabled passengers, for the dignity, respect, and equality they deserved. And she was ready for it. Months had passed, and the landscape of air travel for disabled passengers began to shift, albeit slowly. The disabled passenger, now at the center of a much broader movement, had found her voice. Her advocacy work had taken on a life of its own. What started as a personal battle against an airline's refusal to accommodate her had grown into a full-fledged campaign for systemic change. But while progress was being made, the road ahead still felt uncertain. The wheels of the airline industry turned slowly, and despite the public outcry, it was clear that real change would require more than just awareness. It would require sustained effort from both within the industry and from lawmakers. The disabled passenger continued to use the media attention to her advantage, bringing the issue of accessibility in air travel to the forefront of public consciousness. She had become a familiar face on television talk shows and in newspapers, where she spoke passionately about the changes needed. She wasn't just a victim of an unfortunate situation. She had transformed into an advocate, a symbol of the ongoing struggle that millions of disabled passengers faced every day. Her voice had gained traction, and it was being heard. In some ways, it felt as though she had become the poster child for the cause, and while the attention was sometimes overwhelming, she also understood the power that came with it. The attention was no longer about her. It was about the collective need for change. Her story had sparked the conversation, but it was the stories of countless other disabled passengers that truly illustrated the depth of the problem. One of the significant moments in this ongoing battle came when a group of disability rights organizations came together to launch a petition calling for mandatory accessibility training for all airline staff. It wasn't just about wheelchair assistance anymore. It was about ensuring that flight crews understood the full spectrum of disabilities and the specific needs passengers might have. The petition gathered thousands of signatures and gained traction in both the media and political circles. Lawmakers took notice. In several cities, local governments began to call for hearings to investigate airline policies and practices related to accessibility. The airline industry, of course, pushed back. Lobbyists argued that the cost of implementing such wide-ranging changes would be too high, and that current regulations were sufficient. But the disabled passenger, with the support of the advocacy groups, refused to back down. She continued to meet with lawmakers, advocating for stronger policies that would hold airlines accountable. One of her key points was the need for consistent procedures across all airlines, so that disabled passengers wouldn't be subjected to a patchwork of policies and accommodations. The system needed to be universal, ensuring that every airline met the same standards for accessibility. In the meantime, the airlines she had flown with during the incident began to feel the heat. Their public relations efforts to smooth over the controversy had failed to stem the tide of criticism. Several class action lawsuits were filed by passengers who had experienced similar issues, and public pressure mounted for the airline to take meaningful action. It wasn't just the disabled community that was speaking up anymore. It was the general public too, recognizing that treating passengers with dignity and respect should be the norm, not the exception. For the disabled passenger, this progress was a bittersweet victory. She felt proud of the strides that were being made, but she also knew the fight was far from over. Change in the airline industry wouldn't come overnight, and the legislative process was slow. But as she looked back on her journey, on the initial shock of being refused a flight and the emotional roller coaster that followed, she realized that her efforts had planted the seeds for something much larger. It wasn't just about her incident anymore. It was about ensuring that the next disabled passenger wouldn't have to face the same hurdles she had. A year later, the disabled passenger stood at a podium in front of a large crowd at a conference for disability rights, her speech prepared, but her heart still racing. The work she had done, the doors she had opened, and the conversations she had sparked had taken on a life of their own. This was the culmination of everything she had fought for, a chance to speak not just for herself, but for every disabled traveler who had ever been made to feel small, invisible, or unimportant in the world of air travel. "Today we stand on the precipice of change," she said, her voice steady but filled with passion. "We stand here because of the work of thousands of individuals, countless stories that have been shared, and the collective strength of a community that refuses to be ignored any longer." What started with one flight, one decision, has turned into a movement that will not stop until every disabled passenger has the same access, respect, and dignity as any other traveler. She paused, looking out at the audience, many of them disabled passengers, some of them advocates, some of them from the airline industry, and some from government. She could see the fire in their eyes, the shared commitment to making real change happen. "We've made progress," she continued, "but we are not finished. We have laws now that mandate accessibility for air travel, and some airlines have taken real steps to improve their training and policies. But this is just the beginning. For too long, we've been treated as an afterthought, as a problem to be managed, rather than as human beings with rights. We're not asking for special treatment. We're asking for equality." She felt the weight of her words settle in the room. This wasn't just about disability. It was about dignity, respect, and humanity. Every single passenger, disabled or not, deserved the same standard of care, and it was up to the airline industry, the government, and society as a whole to ensure that those standards were upheld. The crowd erupted into applause, but the disabled passenger's thoughts were already turning to the future. She knew that real change couldn't be measured by one speech or by the headlines that followed it. It couldn't be measured by how many laws were passed or how many petitions were signed. Real change was measured by the quiet victories, the passengers who no longer had to fear being turned away, the flight attendants who were trained to handle all passengers with respect, and the pilots who knew how to respond to medical needs with professionalism. She had become a part of something far bigger than herself, and in the end, that was what mattered. This wasn't just about her fight or her story. It was about a system, a society that had to learn to value every person equally. It was about ensuring that people with disabilities would never have to face what she had faced again. As she left the podium, a sense of peace washed over her. There was still work to do, no doubt, but the path forward was clearer than ever before. She had started something, and she wasn't going to stop until the world had truly changed for the better. If you found this story interesting, don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this.